Welcome to the Writer's Den. I'm Brenda Joyce Patterson. Today we're on location at Lakeland's historic Terrace Hotel. And I'm so proud and happy to be able to tell you that today's guest is New York Times best-selling author Wiley Cash. Wiley Cash, welcome to Writer's Den. Thank you so much for coming. You have done a lot in a short period of time. 3 books, 3 novels. Let me use my cheat sheet so I can make sure I have your novels properly. The Last Ballad, which is your latest, correct? A Land More Kind Than Home, and This Dark Road to Mercy.
Yes.
Yeah. So, they always ask you this. Did you always think you were going to be a writer? Did you always think you were going to write 3 novels and more?
I always knew I wanted to be. I grew up in a family that told a lot of stories. I grew up in the public library in Gastonia. I was telling the group at the Lakeland Public Library last night. So I grew up around storytellers. I grew up around people who told a lot of lies, a lot of kind of old folk tales, things to entertain kids, to keep you out of trouble, little cautionary tales about, you know, why you shouldn't do certain things outside and all this stuff, or why you should stay away from certain things outside. And then my dad was also the kind of person who told kind of tales. So R.C. Cola, I don't know if you've ever heard of R.C. Cola.
Oh, yes.
His name was Roger Cash, and so he told me that R.C. Cola had been named after him, so I went to school and told that during show and tell. And I learned very quickly that my dad was telling me stories to entertain me and telling me stories that weren't true. And so I began to experiment with stories and tell stories that weren't true and see if I could like kind of stretch the bounds of narrative and fiction. And then when I began to read as a child, I learned that I could disappear into a book. So if it was raining, or if we were on a car trip, or we were doing something that was boring, I could always read. And so I began to develop a love for both telling stories and then reading stories. And it wasn't long before I tried to start writing stories. I started as a poet, actually. I know you're a poet as well.
Yes. I love
But
poetry.
yeah, but I was a bad poet. I was a horrible poet. Yeah. But I went to school, UNC Asheville. They had an undergraduate track in the in the English department for creative writing, and I went there because I wanted to become a better poet, and I was just awful. But I enjoyed writing, and so I began writing the kind of stories that I had grown up hearing and grown up reading. And so I began writing short stories, published my first short story when I was a sophomore in college. I was 19. But then I didn't publish another story for almost 10 years because publication's hard, the market's hard. So I've really published as many novels as I have short stories, probably, to be honest.
Really?
Yeah, but, and so I enjoy writing. It's my career now, but I don't know that I'll always be able to do it. You know, I don't take any of this for granted. Just because I've had 1 book or 3 books and I've got a 4th book under contract, I know the market is fickle. I know the hustle is real, so. I'm doing it now, but I don't know if I'll be lucky enough to do it forever.
Right. I actually, as a poet, and also I write a very little bit of fiction, I am understanding that part about the market is fickle and it is difficult. Actually, it's downright scary sending your work out and saying, please, please, please love me.
Yeah.
Because that's what it is. It's always, please, please, please love me. Yeah. You mentioned about, as a reader, sort of sinking yourself into these worlds that's on the page. Mm-hmm. And I'd seen a thing, an interview with you before where you were talking about when you write, you try to have your settings be tangible. Sure. And what have you. I have to admit, I haven't read all of your work, but the things that I've read, what really touches me, or maybe not touch me, but draws me in, is the fact that you say you're a failed poet, but I think that you have some poetry there, especially the piece that you read actually last night at Lakeland Public Library out of The Last Ballad, where you were talking about your main character, Ella May, right, and how she visits the cemetery and what have you. That one was very evocative, that scene. And I was walking when I was listening to it on audiobook. And in the middle of everything, on the road, I'm like,
Yes, I made Brenda cry during exercise.
yes! And the cars are driving past, and I'm thinking, oh my God, they're gonna think I'm this crazy woman walking down the street because I'm weeping at that point. You do a really good job.
Thank you. Well, I think it's important, you know, my editor kept asking about The Last Ballad, which was a real mess of a book until suddenly it wasn't. At least I feel like it's not. Because I was pulling all these characters and all these different voices and kind of creating this tapestry of narrative and experience. And he was asking me, what do you want this book to feel like? What do you want it to be like? And I just kept saying, I want it to be rich. I want it to feel like life. And I think that we often think that we can make things feel like life if we make them deeply emotional. But we can't, because emotion is a personal thing.
Yes.
And so the things that I'm emotional about, or the way I show emotion, may not be the same way that you'll receive that emotion. And so we have to create physical things. So in the excerpt I read last night, this woman she's lost her son, who was a young boy, and she wants to dress his grave with some kind of memento to, you know, anchor her love in a physical thing. And so she gets a felt poinsettia and a baseball, and she's going to put it on the grave. And so the reader is allowed to instill those objects with all the emotion they might feel over losing a child. And then when these objects are stolen off the grave, it feels like a deep violation because the emotion has been invested in these objects. But if I just wrote a scene where a woman's missing her son and he's passed away, it might not be as real, or it might not live on the page. And so I always tell students that you can't have emotion without things. You can't just foist emotion upon a reader because we don't know what to do with it, because your abstraction is not my abstraction. So how do we bring in physical objects and put the emotion in them? Frank X. Walker, we were talking about Frank X. Walker last night, the Appalachian poet from Kentucky. He has poetry sequences about the murder of Medgar Evers. And one of the poems, which is one of the most powerful in the collection, in that cycle, is about the bullet that kills Medgar Evers, and then what else it does in the kitchen, you know, boomerang around the kitchen.
Right.
And that tight focus on this object of death is so powerful. But if we just gave the death and maybe his wife crying, or, I mean, it would be a hard thing to feel, but the physicality of that bullet is a very powerful.
Right, right. And it's appropriate that you mention the poet, because with poetry, that's the thing, because you don't like a piece of poetry that's trite and sentimental. Usually the poems that stick with you are the ones that's grounded in some physical something. But then in real life, that's how we have emotions, which is why sometimes it's difficult for us to clean our houses. Because each thing that you will pick up is like, oh, grandma so-and-so gave me this. I was 7 years old and dad died. And so it's hard to get rid of those things, which is the perfect thing. Listen to this, you writers. Perfect thing to be able to transmit emotion, transmit a sense of place, is those individual things. And so.
Yeah. The Imagist poet said there is no meaning but in things. So we have to find those things that match to the character and find a way to allow the reader to enter that emotional space through these objects. That's one of those tricks of writing that took me a while to get to, but I think I'm starting to figure out how to work with it.
I think you're doing a really good job. Not that you really need me to tell you that, but going back just briefly to The Last Ballad, so many layers. While that scene that we talked about happens somewhat early in the book, you've given so many layers up to that point that myself, as a reader, I am fully inhabiting her space. And I feel like I'm smelling what she's smelling, seeing, touching, tasting. So it's, yeah, really, really great stuff. Now, all of your books, at least Yes, all of your books, we've mentioned this before, are mostly historical. You like to reach back and what have you. There's a quote, and I'm sorry, I keep doing the quote thing for you, but you did an interview with a person at PBS Books at AWP 18 last year. And let me read the quote, and then if you would talk about it a little bit. You said, "We read history books to find out what happened. We read literature to find out what it felt like." So is that what you're doing with your historical book?
I think so. You know, my first book set primarily in 1986, A Land More Kind Than Homes, about the fallout in the community after a young boy smothered at a healing service in the mountains of North Carolina. And so it's set in 1986. The little boy's brother, who's 9 years old, kind of witnesses the tragedy and asks all these questions about faith and power and adults who mislead people.
Right.
And he's 9 years old, and I was 9 years old in 1986. And in 1986, as a 9-year-old, I'm watching Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, I'm watching Jerry Falwell, I'm watching Jimmy Swaggart do all of these things. And being raised in the Baptist church, I'm trying to piece together, why are these adults lying? Why are these adults taking money from people like my grandmother, right? And so I know those things happened, but I wrote A Land More Kind Than Home to go back to what it felt like to face that kind of reckoning, right? So we know that Jim and Tammy Faye Baker did what they did at PTL. We know Jimmy Swaggart got caught doing what he was doing in Louisiana.
Multiple times.
Yeah, but what does it feel like to be let down by those people we invest so much faith and belief in? And so I took those emotions I had based on those experiences and facts in the 80s and just moved it to a little mountain town in western North Carolina and allowed the reader to understand what it felt like to be a person of faith in the mid-80s and have this facade of faith and fact kind of crumble around you. And then my second novel, This Dark Road to Mercy, is set against the home run race of 1998 between Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa. It's about a washed-up minor league baseball player who kidnaps his two daughters from a foster home. And coincidentally, he played with Sammy Sosa minor league baseball. And Sammy Sosa actually played in my hometown. Played minor league ball, yep.
That's cool.
Yeah, for the Gastonia Rangers. But I was really trying to focus on, why do we believe things we believe despite all the evidence? And so these little girls believe their father's a deadbeat loser because that's what they've been told to believe, but he's trying to show them evidence that he's changed, that he's better. And then at the same time, America is rooting for these national heroes, Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa, which now we know these guys are hopped up on all kind of drugs and all kind of stuff.
Exactly.
But what I love about the summer of 1998 and the fall of 1998 is that's really the last time that Americans were united behind something positive. You know, 1998 and 9/11. 9/11 was awful and tragic and we were all together, but it wasn't positive. But 1998, we turned on our TVs every night and we all cheered for Sosa and McGwire. And it was a good feeling, and then now we realize that it wasn't true. And so going back to that moment, I tried to capture the innocence of that time with this underlying current of falsity. And the state motto of North Carolina is to be rather than to seem. And that's what my first two books are about. It's about things that seem one way but actually are another way, and investigating the spaces between why we believe what we believe.
Right. I would actually say that's the same thing for the third book too. That thread of this is how things seem on the surface, but really key things or key people are sort of betraying that trust of what things seem to be.
Yeah.
Man, heavy duty. Yeah. Really heavy duty, but good,
Sure,
but
yeah.
Heavy duty, because we have to think of these things.
Yeah, like in Last Ballad, this is about a group of impoverished, near-death textile workers that are standing up on a picket line and asking for a living wage. But the mill owners are portraying them as communist, as lazy. They're talking about the need for integration and sullying that cause. I mean, this is the 1929 South. And so they're presenting the strikers as one way, but in reality there's a very different story to the realities of their poverty, of their struggle, of their near-death experiences. And so I really wanted to bring their story to the fore, because this is Last Ballad's based on a real event that happened in 1929 in my hometown. And I never heard about it, nobody talked about it, it's not taught in the schools. And so I asked myself, why? Why has it been covered up? Why is no one talking about this woman who was a civil rights leader and a feminist leader before we even use those phrases and those terms? And it was important to me to get at the truth of that story. That's what I tried to do.
Mm-hmm. I think you did it.
Thank you.
I think you did it. You earlier in our conversation, you talked about sort of the difficulties of submitting your work, well, and the kind of vagaries of this writing life. So you teach 2 places in North Carolina. What do you tell your students about that?
About submitting?
About the writing life, first and foremost, and then about submitting, because obviously that's a sort of necessary evil. Nobody will know that you're there if you don't.
I tell them several things about the writing life. The first thing I always tell them is to find a community, either in a classroom or locally, that you're not related to. Don't give your mom or your spouse your work, because they're going to feel put upon to say it's great. And having somebody tell you that your work's great does not improve your work. It doesn't get it any better. So find a writing community that you can be accountable to, embrace their work if you want them to embrace yours, and be honest and direct and supportive. Also read more than you write, because reading is the fuel to create and to take ideas and to borrow ideas and to get characters from. And then submit your work, and don't worry about rejection, because rejection is just an invitation to get better. A friend of mine is a writer named Matt Bondurant. He teaches over at Ole Miss, and he's a fantastic novelist. And I've heard him say, you can love your writing, but don't love your words. So you can love the act of writing, you can love the experience of writing, you can love the project you're working on, but don't be married to your words. Your words are not representative of the totality of your quality as a writer. And so whenever someone doesn't like your words, it doesn't mean they don't like your writing, it just means they don't like the way you've arranged these words on the page. So rearrange the words, get new words, get different words, and go back to it. Every rejection is nothing but an invitation to get better. And that's, as writers, that's how we have to look at it. And writing is a craft, just like throwing clay on a wheel if you're a potter, or designing a garden if you're a landscape gardener, or if you're a carpenter or a woodworker. So if you're in a writing class and the professor says, this needs some work, you can't go home and pull your hair out. Because if you were taking a carpentry class and the professor said, you've hung this door incorrectly, it's not going to deeply wound you. And carpentry is a craft, just like writing is a craft, just like throwing a pot is a craft. And if you throw a pot on a wheel and it blows apart and sprays clay everywhere, you're not going to think that your soul has been exposed as fraudulent, right? You're going to do better the next time.
Right.
And that's the way you have to be with writing. You have to approach it with that level of engagement and honesty and will and desire to improve.
Right. I'm learning that myself, to think of it as a craft and also as a business. Certainly we all have a job, and at the job we'll do something, do an assignment, and then we'll turn it in to the boss. And then the boss may say, that's not quite it. And then you have to go back and do it. You might grumble a little bit. And I know you said you can't pull your hair out, but you could pull your hair out just a little bit. But then you brush it back into place and you sit down and do what needs to be done. So yeah, I think that oftentimes when a person is beginning to write, they just see the art of it. And so it's like, oh, this was brought to me from God. It came from the heavens. And then they think, well, it's whole and entire of itself. I lead the writing group at our library, and I've led writing groups in other situations. And I like to tell people this when they say, oh, it came from God. I say, well, do you consider yourself made from God? And they usually go, well, yeah, of course, because this is the South, you know. And I say, well, when you get up in the morning and you're getting ready to start your day, do you just go out of your house? You wake up and then you just go out of your house? And they look at me like, wow. And I said, don't you like comb your hair, maybe brush your teeth, change your clothes? Yeah. Hopefully you'll shower or something like that before you go out. And they say, well, of course. And then I said, think of your writing in the same way.
People don't think about the importance of drafting and how it's, you know, the work of writing is never done. Being a writer means you always have homework. Putting something on the page means you can always improve it. And you know, we get married to these first drafts as these brief explosions of light that are perfect and pure and represent exactly the thought that we had in mind. But all writing is failing because we're trying to represent either the world as it is, the world as we want it to be, or the world we've created in our mind. And that act of transposing the world onto the page, we can never do that. You fail the minute you try. So nestle into that failure, and as Samuel Beckett says, try to fail better. Every time you sit down, fail better at getting it right. And don't take it personal when you don't.
That's the hard part. That's the hard part. But you hit the nail on the head. Fail better.
Yeah.
Fail better. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've enjoyed myself greatly. Hardly ever do you have someone that you interview that makes you, the interviewer, feel calmer. I thank you for that.
Of course, thank you.
So that's it for another episode of Writer's Den. And we're thanking the Terrace Hotel for allowing us to film in this lovely location. And thank you for joining us. I hope you'll tune in again.